of my life, and we'll hear a lot about it from our first speaker, Helena Kennedy. In reflecting on this workshop and this session, apart from my knees knocking all the way to the Porter's Lodge at speaking on a topic about which I am wholly I have spent the last 3 years dealing with and researching into the people who were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa in the 1960s. And it struck me that one of the differences, as it seemed to me, between racial and gender inequality and discrimination was that with race discrimination, historically, the problem was a belief that some races were inferior to others. And I just made a film on the Rivonia trial, and it includes an extraordinary clip of an Afrikaner, saying with an absolutely straight face that the problem with the black man is that he's like a child and you have to treat him like a child. And if you treat him strictly and severely, then you can control him. But if you don't, he'll start taking liberties like a child. And in the case of gender inequality and discrimination, living in this country, plainly it had the same origins. I never forget when in one of the main textbooks on contract law, there was under the general chapter heading of capacity to enter into legal contracts, there was a subheading which was entitled Lunatics, Prisoners and Married Women. And the common ingredient of these three was that they all lacked the legal capacity to enter into contracts in England, at any rate up until the 19th century. But if you lived in liberal middle-class England were brought up in the 1950s and 60s, the received cultural assumption was that the genders were equal, and the problem was that that assumption did not reflect the reality of how the genders were treated in practice. The problem, as it appeared to be for many people, was not that people justified inequalities, but rather that they didn't recognise that they existed. Anecdotally, I grew up very proud of the fact that my mother, who was a refugee from Hitler, was the only student in her year, the only undergraduate in her year, to get a first in philosophy under Wittgenstein at Cambridge. And it was only when she was in her mid-80s, when Cambridge sent out a letter saying, Nostra culpa, ladies, would you like to come and get your degrees? That I realised that she had never actually got a degree. And she then showed me her degree certificate, which said, this is to certify that Hedvig Simon is entitled to the style of Bachelor of Arts, not is a Bachelor of Arts. And so my mum went up to Cambridge to get her undergraduate degree, aged 88. She lifted the average age of the Union graduands that year by quite a bit. My son, who was graduating at Clare, got his undergraduate degree, and I went up and got an MA. So we made a meal of it. But it simply revealed to me that something that I had taken for granted was in fact not thus. And it reminded me also that when I was at Cambridge in the early 70s, I vividly remember a conversation in my lodgings, sitting in the bath in the kitchen, because that's what the kind of lodgings it was in those days, and my landlady, who is now a very distinguished professor, Elena Levin, was explaining to me the women's lib movement. And I recall with deep embarrassment now, in retrospect, reacting to this with a sense of bafflement, because nothing that she said rang true to my experience of life. I had grown up in professional middle-class London, and I had not, it had not penetrated my consciousness that women were treated differently from men to their disadvantage. And it is a salutary insight into the fact that however rational you like to think you are, and however well-disposed you are, and however many process of ratiocination you apply to issues of discrimination and inequality, actually you see things differently when you are not the victim of inequality or discrimination than if you are. And to this day, I'm reminded of that fact by the fact that I am lucky enough to have 2 and nearly 3 daughters-in-law, all of whom are passionate feminists. And every time we have discussions about quotas, which tends to be the area of pitched battles on what you do about changing gender equality, we never make much headway. But I'm left on each occasion reflecting back to my earlier experiences and assuming against myself that although I think I'm seeing things objectively, I'm almost certainly not. And so coming to this workshop is extremely eye-opening and very humbling and extremely interesting. So I'm very grateful to be here, even though I feel a bit of a fraud to be chairing this session. Our first speaker is Helena Kennedy. We're not allowed titles, but she's a member of the House of Lords. And she's a human rights lawyer of great distinction. She is a writer, a dramatist. She used to be in charge of the Genetics Commission. There's nothing, she's the head of Mansfield College. There's nothing that Helena hasn't done. I attribute it mostly to the fact that we took silk on precisely the same day, I'm ashamed to say 26 years ago.
Yes.
Helena.
Well, because we're so old. We're so old, that's what we're complaining about. It's really lovely to be here, and I'm standing up only because, you see, if you're trained as a barrister, it's the only way that you really kind of feel that you can actually summon up the kind of oxygen levels that one needs when we're getting to the late afternoon. I feel that many of these things that I'm going to say are going to be very familiar to you. I just want to do a little reprise of my own work in this area. I wrote a book 25 years ago called Eve Was Framed. It was a book in which the title, I suppose, in some ways says it all, or it confuses people totally. But it was basically, I was brought up in an Irish Catholic family in Scotland, and we were, my grandmother, my mother, everybody, we were all brought up, the whole business of the Virgin Mary and how women were to behave and so on. And my grandmother used to say there'd be no bad men if there were no bad women. And my mother would say, there's one thing worse than a drunk man, it's a drunk woman. And I'm afraid that I was brought up amongst women who were not that gentle on other women. You know, they were pretty tough on other women. And it became very clear to me very quickly, as soon as I became an adolescent and a teenager, that actually women were somehow judged by different standards, and that you know, often women were blamed for things where, you know, now we would think that blaming was deeply inappropriate. And so I had this sort of quizzical thing about the expectations around good womanhood. And then, of course, I started practicing at the bar. I was somebody who already had quite a strong sense of class politics because of my family. My father was a trade unionist, and my parents were great Labour people in Scotland. And so the idea of social change, my family were working class, and so I had a very strong sense of the nature of class divisions in society and how society worked by the time I came to London to study law. What was still new, and I became, I studied from 68 to 72, I qualified in 1972, and that was when the women's movement was burgeoning. Mm-hmm. And so I joined the women's movement, and I still to this day would proudly call myself a socialist feminist. I don't think you can resolve issues to do with inequality for women unless you can address the wider social injustices in society. And so, you know, women in the United States and all over the place can carry on talking about the gains that are being made for women, and yes, we can make lots of gains, but in reality, it's what's now the word that's used is intersectionality. You know, it's not just about the business of gender. It's about where it interacts with race, where it also interacts with your class, where it interacts with, you know, a whole set of different things that coming together makes the business of gender even more complex. Now, when I wrote Eve Was Framed, the reason I was writing it was that because I hadn't spent my life representing women. I had done a certain, probably a high percentage of work for women by comparison with other people in the criminal law in which I practiced. But from an early stage, because of becoming involved in the early 70s in the women's movement and women's liberation, and at the very time when Nick was having explained to him why women's lib mattered, I was too, and I was going to consciousness raising groups and becoming much more aware of something like patriarchy, which was a newly invented word to describe this whole ideological overplay, which really explained the power relations that are behind this. And it amuses me just now when we're having all this debate about men touching women's knees and so on, that what seems to be mistaken in all misunderstood in all of this is it is actually about abuses of power. And